Detroit, 1984. Rain hammered the streets like bullets against concrete. The kind of night where visibility drops to nothing and every shadow holds a secret. At 11:47 p.m., dispatch received a transmission. The voice was calm, professional. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley reporting a possible disturbance near the Rouge River Industrial District. You check it out. Be back in 20. The radio crackled. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then hours. When backup arrived at the coordinates Bradley had given, they found his motorcycle still running, its headlight cutting a lonely path through the darkness. The engine hummed. The kickstand was up as if he'd just stepped away for a moment. But Thomas Bradley was gone. For 14 years, Detroit held its breath, waiting for answers that never came. The city moved on. Cases piled up. New officers replaced old ones. Life continued. But some questions don't fade. They wait. They grow. They become legends whispered in precinct hallways and family kitchens. This is the story of what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. When a routine walk turns into a revelation. When a loyal dog unearths more than bones, it unearths the truth. Thomas Bradley wasn't supposed to be working that night. He'd switched shifts with a younger officer, Marcus Chin, who wanted to attend his daughter's first piano recital. Bradley had smiled, waved him off. Go, he'd said. Family comes first. The irony wouldn't be lost on anyone later. Bradley was 42 years old, a 15-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department. His personnel file read like a textbook example of steady service. No dramatic heroics, no controversies, just consistent, reliable police work. His fellow officers called him the anchor because when things got chaotic, Bradley remained calm. He had 2 daughters, Sarah, 14, and Emily, 11. His wife Margaret taught elementary school. They lived in a modest house on the east side, the kind with a front porch where Bradley would sit on summer evenings, reading the paper while the girls played hopscotch on the sidewalk. Ordinary. Safe. Predictable. That November night started like any other. Bradley arrived at the precinct at 10 p.m. for the night shift. He joked with the desk sergeant about the weather, grabbed coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, and headed out on his patrol motorcycle. The industrial district along the Rouge River wasn't glamorous territory. Abandoned warehouses stood like tombstones marking Detroit's fading manufacturing glory. At night, the area attracted petty criminals, vandals, and occasionally someone looking for a quiet place to hide. Bradley's last transmission came at 11:47 p.m. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Possible 10 to 90 near Warehouse District, River Road and Jefferson. Investigating. Over. A 10 to 90 meant a possible disturbance. Vague enough to be anything from kids breaking windows to something more serious. Dispatch acknowledged. Standard procedure. At 12:15 a.m., dispatch tried to raise Bradley for a routine check-in. No response. At 12:30 a.m. they tried again. Static. By 12:45 a.m., 3 patrol cars were racing toward Bradley's last known location. Officer James Morrison arrived first. His headlights swept across the empty lot. There, impossibly alone in the vastness, sat Bradley's motorcycle. The engine was still running, the headlights still on, pointing toward an abandoned warehouse with boarded windows. Morrison approached cautiously, his hand on his weapon. The motorcycle was untouched. Bradley's helmet sat in its carry case. His radio microphone dangled from its clip, swaying slightly in the wind. But Bradley himself? Gone. Morrison's beam traced the ground. No blood. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading away. The rain had seen to that, washing away any trail that might have existed. It was as if Thomas Bradley had simply stepped off the edge of the world. Within an hour, the area swarmed with police. Search dogs barked and strained at their leashes. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness like fireflies. Officers shouted Bradley's name until their voices went hoarse. Nothing. As dawn broke, the search expanded. Helicopters thrummed overhead. Dive teams plunged into the murky Rouge River. Every warehouse, every building, every storm drain within a mile radius was searched, then searched again. The department brought in specialists. Bloodhounds followed scent trails that led nowhere. Crime scene investigators found no evidence of violence. Bradley's service weapon was missing. He'd been carrying it, but nothing else seemed disturbed. Detective Raymond Cole, assigned to lead the investigation, stood in the gray morning light and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd worked missing persons cases before, but this was different. Police officers didn't just vanish. There were procedures, backup, constant communication. It's like he was plucked right out of reality, Cole muttered to his partner. The first theory was simple. Bradley had been called to the scene by someone who knew him, someone who'd planned this. But why? Oh. The second theory was darker. Bradley had been involved in something he shouldn't have been. Maybe he'd taken bribes, crossed the wrong people, gotten in over his head. But everyone who knew Bradley rejected this immediately. The man was straight as an arrow, sometimes annoyingly so. The third theory, whispered but never officially voiced, Bradley had walked away. Left his life behind. Started over somewhere else. Margaret Bradley heard that theory and felt her world crack. The knock came at 2:37 a.m. Margaret Bradley had been dozing on the couch, waiting. Tom was often late, the job demanded it, but something about this night felt wrong. A wife's intuition maybe, or just the storm that wouldn't let up. She opened the door to find Sergeant Donald Reeves, Tom's supervisor, standing in the rain. His face told her everything before his mouth could form the words. Margaret? Tom didn't come back from patrol. We're looking for him now. I'm sure there's an explanation. The explanation never came. Those first days existed in a fog. Margaret moved through her house like a ghost, making coffee she didn't drink, answering phones that never stopped ringing. Sarah and Emily clung to each other, their faces pale, their eyes searching their mother's face for reassurance she couldn't give. Dad's coming back, right? Emily asked on the third day. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I don't know, baby. The police came daily with updates that weren't really updates. They'd searched here. Found nothing there. Followed this lead. Hit that dead end. Margaret printed flyers. Tom's face, smiling from last Christmas, stared out from every telephone pole and storefront window in a 10-block radius. Missing. Please help find him. The news media descended like locusts. For a week, Tom Bradley was the lead story. Cameras followed Margaret to the grocery store. Reporters ambushed her at the school where she taught. Mrs. Bradley, do you think your husband is still alive? Mrs. Bradley, is it true he had gambling debts? Mrs. Bradley, some sources say he was planning to leave. She stopped answering. Stopped watching. Stopped reading. The department held a vigil on the 2-week anniversary of Tom's disappearance. Hundreds of officers stood in silence outside the precinct, their badges covered with black bands. Margaret attended, flanked by her daughters, and watched men she'd known for years cry openly. But as weeks became months, the search scaled back. The news moved on to other tragedies. The flyers faded and peeled away in the weather. Friends stopped calling as often. The casseroles stopped appearing on the doorstep. People didn't know what to say anymore, so they said nothing. Margaret returned to teaching because they needed money. Tom's paycheck had stopped. The department offered assistance, but there were forms, bureaucracy, endless questions she didn't have answers to. Is your husband deceased? I don't know. Has he been declared legally dead? No. Then I'm sorry we can't process this until... She hung up. The worst part wasn't the not knowing. It was the whispers. Margaret heard them at the grocery store, at parent-teacher conferences, at church. People didn't say things to her face, but their eyes did the talking. Some pitied her. Poor Margaret, left alone with 2 girls. Others judged. She must have known. He must have told her something. And some, these were the cruelest, blamed her. If she'd been a better wife, maybe he wouldn't have left. Sarah started acting out at school, picking fights, her grades plummeting. Emily stopped talking altogether for 3 months, communicating only through notes and nods. On the first anniversary of Tom's disappearance, the department held a small ceremony. Detective Cole pulled Margaret aside afterward. I want you to know, he said, his voice rough, I haven't stopped. I won't stop. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. But she saw it in his eyes too, the doubt, the acceptance, the quiet resignation. Tom Bradley was never coming home. In year 2, Margaret did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She went to the hardware store and bought a motion sensor light for the front porch. She installed it herself, standing on a wobbly ladder, tears streaming down her face. When she flipped the switch and the light blazed to life, she stood in its glow and made a promise to the empty street. "I'm not giving up on you." That light stayed on every night for the next 12 years. Neighbors grew used to it, that steady beacon burning in the Bradley house. Some found it hopeful. Others found it sad. Margaret found it necessary. She developed a routine. Work, home, dinner with the girls. Homework, bedtime, then sitting on that porch in a creaky wicker chair, watching the street as if Tom might round the corner any moment, his motorcycle rumbling, his smile apologetic. "Sorry I'm late, Maggie. You wouldn't believe the day I had." But he never came. Sarah graduated high school. Emily followed 4 years later. Both left for college, escaping the shadow their house had become. They called weekly, visited monthly, but Margaret could see the relief in their eyes when they left. This house held ghosts. Not dead ones, those you could mourn. No, this house held the ghost of uncertainty, of questions without answers, of a man who existed somewhere between life and death, present and absent. Detective Cole retired in 1992. On his last day he visited Margaret. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I failed him. I failed you." Margaret shook her head. "You tried. That's more than most." He handed her his card. "If anything at all, comes up, call me. I don't care if I'm retired. I don't care if it's Christmas. You call." She kept that card in her wallet for 6 years before she'd need it. The police department officially classified Thomas Bradley's case as cold in 1989. His name joined hundreds of others in filing cabinets, relegated to the past, to the category of mysteries that would likely never be solved. But Margaret kept the porch light burning. And somewhere in Detroit, in an industrial lot choked with weeds and rusted metal, the truth waited patiently to be found. Robert Keller didn't believe in fate. He was a practical man, a 48-year-old auto worker at the Ford plant, the kind of guy who fixed his own car, balanced his own checkbook, and thought horoscopes were nonsense. But on a cool October morning in 1998, fate, or something like it, came looking for him in the form of a stubborn beagle named Duke. Keller had adopted Duke from a shelter 6 months earlier. The dog was older, scarred, with one ear that wouldn't quite stand upright. Nobody else wanted him. Keller, recently divorced and living alone, figured they could be unwanted together. Duke turned out to be the best decision Keller had made in years. The dog didn't judge, didn't complain, just wanted walks, food, and occasionally to be told he was a good boy. That particular morning, Keller took his usual route through the old industrial district. Most people avoided the area. It had a reputation for being rough. But Keller had grown up in these neighborhoods. He knew which blocks were truly dangerous and which just looked that way. Besides, Duke liked it. Lots of interesting smells. They were passing a vacant lot near where the old Strathmore warehouse had collapsed years ago when Duke suddenly stopped, his body going rigid. "Come on, boy," Keller urged, tugging the leash. Duke didn't budge. His nose twitched. Then, with a determination Keller had never seen in the lazy dog, Duke began digging. "Duke, no. We don't have time for." The dog ignored him, his paws working furiously at the hard-packed earth. Keller sighed and checked his watch. He had 20 minutes before his shift started. "Fine. 2 minutes, then we go." Duke dug deeper. Dirt flew. And then Keller heard it, the scrape of claws against metal. "What you got there?" Keller knelt down. Duke had uncovered the corner of something. Keller brushed away the dirt, revealing a surface eaten by rust but still intact. A metal box. Maybe a foot square, heavy. Keller's practical mind immediately went to treasure. Maybe someone had buried cash, jewelry, something valuable. It happened. He'd heard stories. He pulled a pocket knife from his jeans and worked at the corroded latch. It resisted, then gave way with a screech of metal on metal. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had yellowed with age, were items that made Keller's blood run cold. A badge. Detroit Police Department. The number barely visible under the corrosion, 2847. A gold wedding band. Engraved inside, T&M Forever, 1972. A patch of fabric, dark blue, unmistakably uniform material. And on it, stains that had turned brown with time but were obviously blood. A photograph, sealed in its own plastic wrapper. A man in police uniform, smiling. 2 little girls sitting on his lap. And a single bullet casing. Keller sat back on his heels, his heart hammering. Duke nuzzled his hand, sensing distress. This wasn't treasure. This was evidence. Evidence of what Keller didn't want to imagine. He looked around the vacant lot, suddenly aware of how alone he was. Whoever buried this box didn't want it found. Burying evidence meant hiding a crime. And people who hide crimes don't appreciate discovery. Keller's first instinct was to rebury it, walk away, pretend this never happened. But he looked at the photograph again. The man's smile. The little girls' faces. Someone's husband. Someone's father. Damn it, Keller muttered. He pulled out his cell phone, one of those new bulky things he'd bought reluctantly, and dialed 911. The police treated Robert Keller like a suspect at first. It made sense in a grim way. Man finds evidence, man probably put evidence there. Basic logic. Keller spent 4 hours at the precinct that afternoon, missing his shift, answering the same questions in different configurations. How did you know where to dig? I didn't. My dog did. Have you ever been arrested? Once, public intoxication, 1979. I was 22. Did you know Thomas Bradley? Who's Thomas Bradley? That last question made the detective interviewing him, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen Ortiz, pause. You don't know who Thomas Bradley is? Should I? Ortiz studied him for a long moment, then slid the photograph across the table. This is Thomas Bradley. He was a police officer. He disappeared in 1984. Keller looked at the photo, then at Ortiz. 1984? I would have been 34. Working at Ford. I don't remember hearing about this. It was big news. I don't watch the news. Depressing. Ortiz almost smiled. Almost. Mr. Keller, we're going to need to verify your story. This could take a while. Verify away. I've got nothing to hide. Well, except my tax returns, but that's between me and the IRS. It took 3 days for the police to confirm Keller's story. Co-workers vouched for his character. His ex-wife, despite their acrimonious divorce, admitted he was annoyingly honest. His landlord confirmed he'd only lived in his current apartment for 8 months. Before that, he'd been across town, nowhere near the industrial district. Most convincingly, forensic analysis of the metal box suggested it had been buried for over a decade. Keller would have been in his 30s with no connection to Bradley, no motive, no opportunity. He was telling the truth. He'd just gotten lucky. Or unlucky depending on perspective. While Keller was being cleared, the real investigation exploded to life. Detective Cole, long retired, got a call on a Tuesday afternoon. He was in his garage building a bookshelf for his granddaughter when his wife called him inside. Ray, it's the precinct. They say it's about the Bradley case. Cole almost dropped his hammer. He'd been retired 6 years. The Bradley case had been cold for 9. Why would they? Detective Cole? The voice on the phone was young, unfamiliar. This is Detective Helen Ortiz. I know you're retired, but we've found something. Evidence in the Bradley disappearance. We could really use your insight. Cole was in his car 10 minutes later, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. At the precinct, Ortiz laid out the contents of the box. Cole touched each item with trembling fingers, his mind racing back 14 years. The badge was Bradley's. The number matched records. The wedding ring's inscription, T&M Forever, matched Margaret's maiden name, Margaret Holloway. The uniform patch showed Bradley's station assignment. But it was the photograph that broke Cole's heart. He remembered seeing it on Margaret's mantle. Bradley had just made lieutenant. Sarah and Emily were toddlers. Everyone was smiling. The blood on the fabric is definitely human, Ortiz said quietly. We're running DNA, but it'll take a few weeks to get results. The bullet casing is from a .38 caliber weapon. Not standard police issue. Cole nodded slowly. So someone shot him, buried evidence, thought they'd gotten away clean. That's our theory. After 14 years, why surface now? Maybe they thought enough time had passed. Maybe the site was scheduled for development and they needed to move it. Maybe, Ortiz paused. Maybe they just got careless. Cole pulled out his old case files, the ones he'd kept despite retirement. He'd never been able to let the Bradley case go. It haunted him. When Bradley disappeared, Cole said, spreading papers across the table, we looked at everything. His finances were clean. No affairs. No complaints against him. No one with an obvious grudge. No one obvious, Ortiz echoed. What about the not obvious? Cole flipped through pages of notes, names, interviews. Then he stopped. His finger tapped a name written in faded ink. Edward Miller. Who's he? Small-time criminal. Bradley arrested him in 1982 for assault. Miller did 18 months at Jackson. Got out in early 1984. Maybe 6 months before Bradley disappeared. Ortiz leaned forward. What was the assault? Miller beat a man half to death outside a bar. The victim testified Miller went down. But at sentencing, Miller screamed at the judge, at the victim, at... Cole's voice dropped. At Bradley. Said he'd make him pay. Said it was personal. Death threat. Borderline. Enough to note in the file, not enough to act on. Cops get threatened all the time. Where's Miller now? That took 3 hours to find. Edward Miller had bounced around after his release. A series of addresses, all in Detroit, each one a little more rundown than the last. No steady employment. A few more arrests, drunk and disorderly, petty theft, but nothing major. His current address, a boarding house in Hamtramck, barely 10 miles from where the box was found. Ortiz assembled a team. They'd approach Miller carefully. After 14 years, they couldn't afford to spook him. They arrived at dawn, that gray hour when the world hasn't decided if it wants to wake up. The boarding house was exactly as depressing as expected. Peeling paint, sagging porch, windows covered with yellowed curtains. Miller answered on the third knock. He was 53 years old but looked 70. Prison and hard living had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell that smelled of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. Edward Miller? Who's asking? Ortiz held up her badge. Detroit Police. We need to talk to you about Thomas Bradley. For just a second, less than a heartbeat, something flickered in Miller's eyes. Fear? Guilt? Satisfaction? Then his face went neutral. Don't know the name. Really? Because our records show he arrested you in 1982. Lots of cops arrested me. Can't remember them all. They brought him in anyway, not under arrest but for questioning. Miller came willingly, which was either a sign of innocence or supreme confidence. In the interrogation room they laid it out. The box. The badge. The blood. The photograph. Miller stared at the items without expression. We know you threatened Bradley, Ortiz said. Multiple witnesses heard you at your sentencing. That was 14 years ago. I was angry. People say things when they're angry. Where were you on November 12, 1984? Miller shrugged. How should I know? That was forever ago. Try to remember. Can't. They went in circles for 2 hours. Miller gave nothing. He wasn't nervous, wasn't defensive. He just existed in that room like a man who'd learned long ago that silence was safer than words. Finally Cole, who'd been observing through the one-way glass, entered the room. Miller's eyes flicked to him and something shifted. You, Miller said. I remember you. I remember you too, Eddie. Cole sat down slowly. His body ached. Retirement had been good for his blood pressure but hell on his joints. You said something to me once. Outside the courthouse. You said, that cop took 2 years of my life. One day I'll take all of his. Miller's face remained blank. Sounds like the kind of stupid thing a pissed-off kid would say. You were 37. Stupid doesn't have an age limit. Cole leaned forward. Here's what I think happened. Bradley arrested you. You went to prison. You festered. And when you got out, you decided to settle the score. You called him that night, told him there was trouble, lured him to that warehouse district. And when he showed up, You're writing a hell of a story, detective. It's not a story if it's true. Prove it. And there it was, the challenge. The thing that separated suspicion from evidence, theory from conviction. They tried. For 3 more hours they tried. But Miller knew the game. He played it before. Without concrete evidence tying him to the scene, without a weapon, without a witness, they had nothing but circumstantial speculation. At 7 p.m. they had to let him go. Miller stood at the precinct exit, buttoning his jacket. He looked at Cole and smiled, a cold, knowing smile that said everything his words hadn't. Then he walked out into the Detroit night. Ortiz slammed her hand against the wall. Damn it. He did it. We know he did it. Knowing isn't proving, Cole said quietly. But he wasn't giving up. Neither was Ortiz. They spent the next week building a case. They pulled Miller's phone records from 1984, spotty and incomplete, but they showed calls from a payphone near the warehouse district. They canvassed the boarding house, finding a neighbor who remembered Miller disappearing for a few hours that November night and returning, different somehow. Quieter. They searched his room, finding nothing. No gun, no souvenirs, no smoking gun. Then on day 9 they caught a break. A forensic team was excavating the lot where the box had been found, looking for anything else that might be buried. They found nothing immediately around the box, but 20 feet away, partially buried under what was once the warehouse foundation, they found it. A .38 caliber revolver rusted beyond use, its serial number obliterated. But microscopic analysis showed tool marks consistent with the bullet casing found in the box. More importantly, they found trace amounts of DNA on the handle. 2 sources. One matched the blood on the uniform patch, likely Bradley's. The other. It took 4 days to get the results. The second DNA profile matched Edward Miller. They arrested him at 6 a.m. on a cold October morning, exactly 14 years and 11 months after Thomas Bradley's disappearance. This time Miller wasn't calm. This time, when Ortiz read him his rights, his hands shook. "We have your DNA on the murder weapon," she said in the interrogation room. "We have your threats on record. We have your lack of alibi. We have everything, Eddie." Miller stared at the table. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally, "I want a lawyer." "That's your right. But first..." Miller looked up, his eyes hollow. "First I'll tell you something. Not for the court. Not for the record. Just so you know." Ortiz glanced at Cole, who nodded slightly. "Go ahead." Miller's voice was flat, emotionless. "He took everything from me. My freedom, my reputation, my life. So yeah, I took his. I called him that night, told him I had information about a crime, somewhere we could meet private. He came because that's what good cops do, they show up. And then I shot him. He didn't even reach for his gun. He was trying to talk to me, trying to calm me down. Stupid. Should have shot first." The room went silent except for the hum of the recording device that Miller had forgotten was there, despite Ortiz's explicit statement at the start. "Where's the body, Eddie?" Miller's smile returned, cold and bitter. "You want closure? That'll cost you." "Cost us what?" "Deal. I tell you where he is, you don't pursue the death penalty." Ortiz wanted to refuse. Wanted to spit in his face. But this wasn't about what she wanted. It was about Margaret Bradley. About Sarah and Emily. About a family that had waited 14 years for answers. "I'll talk to the prosecutor." The deal took 3 days to negotiate. Life without parole, but Bradley's death would officially be classified as second-degree murder, not first. Miller would serve his time in Michigan, not be extradited anywhere else. Small concessions, but they mattered to a man facing decades in a cage. On a gray November morning, a convoy of police vehicles followed Edward Miller's directions through the industrial outskirts of Detroit. They drove past the vacant lot where the box had been found, past collapsed warehouses and crumbling roads, until Miller pointed to a spot that looked like everywhere else, overgrown, forgotten, unmarked. "There," he said. "Under the old drainage culvert." The excavation crew worked carefully, treating the site with the reverence it deserved. Officers stood in a circle, silent, as the backhoe lifted away layers of earth and concrete. 3 hours in, they found the first fragment. A piece of cloth, dark blue, preserved by the dry soil and concrete above it. Then bones. Carefully, respectfully, the coroner's team uncovered what remained of Lieutenant Thomas Bradley. He'd been buried in his uniform, his service weapon tucked under his arm like a final insult. The bullet had entered his chest, probably killed him instantly. At least there was that, he hadn't suffered long. Detective Cole stood at the edge of the excavation site, tears streaming down his face. After 14 years of questions, here was the answer. Not the one anyone wanted, but an answer nonetheless. Margaret Bradley had to be told. The knock came at 3:27 p.m. on a Thursday. Margaret was grading papers at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside her. She'd kept teaching all these years, finding purpose in the simple rhythm of education, of shaping young minds, of creating order in a world that had shown her chaos. The porch light burned in the daylight as it always did. She knew before she opened the door. Maybe it was the way Detective Cole stood, older now, his shoulders bent, or maybe it was something in the air, a shift in reality that said, "This is it. This is the day." "Hello, Ray." "Hello, Margaret." His voice cracked. "Can I come in?" They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd told her daughters that their father was missing, where she'd held vigils alone at midnight, where she'd celebrated and mourned every milestone without her husband. Cole told her everything. The box. The evidence. Miller's confession. The excavation. "We found him, Margaret. We found Tom." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret didn't cry. Not yet. There would be time for tears later. Now she needed facts, details, the concrete reality that would replace 14 years of terrible imagination. How? Her voice was steady. How did he die? Quickly. He didn't suffer. A small mercy in a merciful world. Did he? Margaret swallowed. Did he know? At the end? Cole understood the question. Did Bradley know he was dying? Did he have time to think of his family, to regret taking that call, to send some final thought out into the universe? "I don't know," Cole admitted. "But I knew Tom. If he had even a second, he was thinking of you. Of Sarah and Emily. That's who he was." Margaret nodded. Her hands, resting on the table, were perfectly still. Years of waiting had taught her a terrible kind of patience. "What happens now?" "Miller will be sentenced. Life without parole. He'll die in prison." "Good." The word came out flat, without emotion. Not satisfaction, not anger, just acknowledgement of fact. "We'll release Tom's remains to you when the coroner finishes. The department wants to hold a service. Full honors. I want to see him." Cole blinked. "Margaret. I want to see him, Ray. I know what 14 years in the ground does to a body. I don't care. I need to see him." It wasn't protocol. It wasn't recommended. But Cole made a call, pulled strings, and 2 days later, Margaret Bradley stood in the coroner's office, looking at what remained of her husband. It wasn't much. Bones, scraps of fabric, the ghost of the man she'd loved. But it was him. It was real. It was no longer a question mark floating in the dark. She stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the cold steel table. "I kept the light on," she whispered. "Every night. I kept it on." A coroner's assistant, standing respectfully at the back of the room, wiped her eyes. The department held the service on a Saturday. It seemed like all of Detroit turned out, hundreds of officers in dress blues, civilians who'd never met Bradley but felt his story, media respectfully keeping their distance for once. The chief spoke. Other officers spoke. Cole spoke, his voice breaking multiple times. Margaret sat in the front row, flanked by her daughters. Sarah, now 29, was an attorney in Chicago. Emily, 25, was a social worker in Ann Arbor. Both had taken emergency leave, both had come home to the city they'd fled years ago. "I don't remember him," Emily admitted the night before the service, her voice small. "Not really. Just fragments. The way he smelled, like coffee and leather. His laugh. But not his face. Not clearly. I remember," Sarah said. "I remember everything. And I hate that I do." Margaret held her daughters close. You don't have to hate it. You can remember the good. The good was real too. At the service, the chief presented Margaret with an American flag, folded into the perfect triangle. Then he unveiled a plaque. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, badge 2847, end of watch. November 12, 1984, recovered. October 1998, steady. Fair. First in. Last out. The plaque would hang in the precinct lobby. Every officer entering the building would pass it, a reminder that some debts of honor are never forgotten. Edward Miller's trial was brief. With his confession and the overwhelming evidence, his lawyer advised him to plead guilty, avoid a prolonged trial that would only make things worse. Miller stood in court, shackled and gray, as the judge read the sentence. Edward Miller, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the remainder of your natural life incarcerated for the murder of Lieutenant Thomas Bradley. Do you have anything to say? Miller looked at Margaret, who sat in the gallery with her daughters. For a moment, everyone thought he might apologize. Might show some flicker of remorse. Instead he shrugged. He shouldn't have arrested me. The courtroom erupted. The judge's gavel cracked like gunfire, demanding order. Margaret didn't flinch. She'd expected nothing from Miller, and that's exactly what she got. You can't squeeze remorse from a stone. As bailiffs led Miller away, he shuffled past the gallery. His eyes met Margaret's one last time. She didn't look away. Didn't blink. Just stared until he dropped his gaze and disappeared through the door that would seal his fate. Sarah gripped her mother's hand. It's over. Yes, Margaret said quietly. It's over. But in truth, nothing ever really ends. It just transforms, shifts shape, becomes something else. The burial happened on a cold December day, exactly 1 month after they'd found Tom's remains. The department arranged everything. A plot in Woodlawn Cemetery, a headstone carved with precision and care, an honor guard that stood in perfect formation despite the biting wind. 21 rifles fired a salute. The shots echoed across the cemetery, sharp and final. A bugler played taps, the notes hanging in the frozen air like a prayer. Margaret accepted the folded flag from the chief. She held it against her chest, feeling its weight, its reality. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, she stayed behind. Sarah and Emily stood a respectful distance away, giving their mother space. Margaret knelt beside the freshly turned earth. I'm sorry it took so long, she whispered. I'm sorry I couldn't find you. But I never stopped looking. I want you to know that. I never stopped. The wind rustled through bare trees. Somewhere a crow called out. Margaret placed her hand on the cold ground. You can rest now. We all can. That night, for the first time in 14 years, Margaret Bradley turned off the porch light. She stood at the switch for a long time, her finger hovering, trembling. Turning it off felt like betrayal, like giving up, like admitting defeat. But she wasn't giving up. She was letting go. There's a difference. The light clicked off. Darkness filled the porch. Margaret stood in that darkness and cried, not the silent, dignified tears she'd allowed herself in public, but deep, racking sobs that came from a place she'd kept locked away for 14 years. Sarah and Emily found her there, pulled her into their arms and cried with her. They cried for their father. For their lost childhood. For the family that could have been. For the man who'd switched shifts on a stormy night and never came home. But they also cried in relief. The not knowing had been its own kind of torture. Now they knew. The story had an ending, even if it wasn't the one they'd wanted. Recovery doesn't happen overnight. It's not a switch you flip or a decision you make. It's a process, slow and painful, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Margaret went back to teaching. Her students noticed something different about Mrs. Bradley that winter. She smiled more easily, laughed at their jokes, seemed lighter somehow. One student, a perceptive girl named Hannah, asked after class one day, Mrs. Bradley, are you okay? You seem different. Margaret considered the question carefully. I'm sad, she said honestly. But I'm also relieved. Sometimes you can be both at the same time. Hannah nodded, satisfied with an answer that acknowledged complexity rather than pretending everything was fine. 6 months after Tom's burial, Margaret did something that surprised even herself. She started volunteering at a center for families of missing persons. The center operated out of a modest building in Midtown, funded by donations and staffed mostly by volunteers. It provided resources, support groups, and advocacy for families trapped in the same nightmare Margaret had endured. Her first day, she sat in a circle of strangers who were somehow intimately familiar. Each face carried the same haunted look she'd seen in her own mirror for 14 years. A woman named Patricia spoke first. Her son had vanished 3 years ago, just disappeared after his shift at a convenience store. "The not knowing," Patricia said, her voice breaking, "is killing me." Margaret understood. She understood in a way most people couldn't. "I know," Margaret said quietly. "I understand the waiting." Those simple words opened a floodgate. People who'd been holding everything inside suddenly had permission to let it out. They talked, they cried, they shared stories that ranged from heartbreaking to bizarre to darkly funny. And Margaret listened. That's what she offered. Not advice, not solutions, just the presence of someone who'd walked this path and emerged on the other side. One evening, a new woman arrived at the group. Young, maybe 30, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Her husband had been missing for 6 weeks. "Everyone keeps telling me to have hope," the woman said bitterly. "But what if there is no hope? What if he's never coming back?" The group shifted uncomfortably. Hope was the currency they dealt in, the thing that kept them going. Margaret leaned forward. "Then you'll survive that too. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you will. You'll find a way to carry it." "How?" The woman's voice was desperate. "How did you do it?" Margaret thought about the porch light, the sleepless nights, the years of questions. "Badly at first. Then better. And some days badly again. There's no right way to do this. You just do it." It wasn't the inspirational speech people wanted. But it was honest, and honesty mattered more than inspiration. Sarah visited from Chicago one weekend and found her mother at the center, organizing a resource fair. "Mom," Sarah said, watching her mother coordinate volunteers with practiced efficiency, "when did you become this person?" Margaret looked up from her clipboard. "What person?" "This helper. This advocate. You spent 14 years barely keeping your head above water, and now you're helping everyone else stay afloat." Margaret set down her clipboard and hugged her daughter. "I'm not helping them stay afloat, baby. I'm just swimming next to them so they don't feel so alone." Emily, meanwhile, had channeled her grief into her work. As a social worker, she specialized in trauma counseling for children who'd lost parents to violence or disappearance. "I think about Dad's last moments," Emily admitted to her therapist during one session. "I wonder if he was scared. If he thought about us. If he regretted taking that call." "And what do you do with those thoughts?" the therapist asked. "I use them. When I'm sitting with a kid who just lost a parent, I remember what it felt like to be 11 and have my dad vanish. I remember the confusion, the anger, the desperate need for someone to tell me it would be okay. And I try to be that person for them." "That's a beautiful way to honor your father's memory." Emily wiped her eyes. "I hope so. I really hope so." The Bradley women found their own ways to heal, to transform their pain into something that could help others. It wasn't about forgetting Tom or moving on as if he'd never existed. It was about carrying his memory forward in ways that mattered. On the first anniversary of Tom's reburial, the 3 of them visited his grave together. They brought flowers, daisies, his favorite, and sat on the grass beside the headstone. "I got promoted," Sarah announced. "Made partner at the firm." "Dad would be so proud," Margaret said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I'm dating someone," Emily added shyly. "His name is Marcus. He's kind, patient. He knows about Dad and he doesn't try to fix it. He sounds perfect." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across a brilliant blue sky. "Do you think he's watching?" Emily asked. "From wherever he is?" Margaret considered the question. She'd never been deeply religious, but she'd developed a faith of her own over the years, not in heaven or angels, but in the persistence of love, the way it echoes forward even after someone is gone. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that the best parts of him live on in us. In how we treat people, how we face hardship, how we show up even when it's hard." That's not quite the same as watching from heaven, but it's close enough. Sarah nodded. I like that. They stayed until the sun began to set, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and amber. As they walked back to the car, Margaret looked back one more time. The headstone stood solid and permanent, a marker that said, Thomas Bradley existed. He mattered. He is remembered. Detroit, like any large city, had seen its share of tragedy. Missing persons, unsolved murders, families shattered by violence. These were unfortunate facts of urban life. But the Bradley case touched something deeper. Maybe it was because Tom was a police officer, one of their own. Maybe it was because the story had stretched across 14 years, becoming a cautionary tale told in precinct break rooms and police academies. Or maybe it was simply that everyone could imagine themselves in Margaret's position, waiting, wondering, caught between hope and despair. Whatever the reason, the city decided to learn from what had happened. The police department formed a task force specifically dedicated to missing persons cases involving law enforcement and first responders. They called it the Bradley Protocol. Under the new system, anytime an officer failed to check in, immediate protocols kicked in. GPS tracking on all vehicles became mandatory. Radios got upgraded with emergency beacons that could be triggered silently. Every officer's shift included 2 mandatory check-ins, not just at the end. Detective Helen Ortiz, who'd led the reopened investigation, found herself promoted to head the new unit. The Bradley Protocol saved 3 officers in its first year, she told a reporter from the Detroit Free Press. 3 people who might have ended up like Lieutenant Bradley if we'd moved just a few minutes slower. That's what we owe him, to make sure his death wasn't meaningless. The task force also looked backward, reopening cold cases of missing persons that had been shelved over the years. They found patterns they'd missed before, connections that technology and fresh eyes revealed. 2 cases were solved in the first 18 months. Not as dramatic as Bradley's story, but for 2 families, everything. The city council approved funding for a memorial near the vacant lot where Robert Keller's dog had dug up the metal box. The lot itself was cleaned up, transformed from an abandoned eyesore into a small park. At the center they installed a simple blue bench. Weatherproof, sturdy, designed to last. On the backrest, white letters spelled out, "Found at last." It wasn't a traditional monument, no statue, no plaque with long paragraphs. Just a bench and 4 words. But people understood. The bench became a quiet gathering place. Families of missing persons came to sit, to think, to hope. Others came out of curiosity and stayed because the spot felt peaceful. A local artist painted a mural on the wall of the old building adjacent to the park. It showed a simple image, a porch light glowing in the darkness. No explanation. No name. Just the light. Margaret visited the bench 6 months after it was installed. She sat there for an hour watching people pass by, some stopping to sit, others pausing to read the inscription. A young man sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. "Did you know him?" the man asked after a while, gesturing to the bench. "The cop they found?" Margaret smiled. "Yes. I knew him very well." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment. "I come here sometimes," the man said. "When things get heavy. There's something about this place. It's sad, but it's also, I don't know, hopeful." "That probably sounds stupid." "It doesn't sound stupid at all," Margaret assured him. "It sounds exactly right." The man nodded, stood, and walked away. Margaret stayed, watching the sunset paint the Detroit skyline in shades of orange and purple. The city had learned. Not just about protocols and procedures, but about memory, about honoring those who'd been lost, about creating spaces where grief and hope could coexist. That mattered. Maybe more than anything, that mattered. The Detroit Police Academy added Tom Bradley's case to their curriculum. New recruits learned about that November night, about the disappearance, about the 14-year wait. But they didn't just learn it as a cautionary tale. They learned it as a reminder of the bonds between officers, the responsibility they had to watch out for each other, the importance of family. Lieutenant Bradley went to work that night thinking it was just another shift, one instructor told his class of recruits. He didn't know he was living his last hours. None of us ever do. That's why every call matters. Every check-in matters. Every moment of awareness matters. We owe that to Bradley. We owe it to each other. The recruits listened, their young faces serious. In a few weeks, they'd be out on the streets, facing the same risks Bradley had faced. But now they knew his story. And knowing meant they'd be just a little bit more careful, a little bit more aware. One life lost had, in a strange way, become a shield protecting others. Margaret heard about the academy curriculum from a young officer who stopped her after a support group meeting. "Mrs. Bradley? I'm Officer Jason Chin. I just graduated from the academy and I wanted you to know. We learned about your husband. What happened to him changed how we're trained. He's part of why I'm better prepared to stay safe out there." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for telling me that." "No, thank you. For keeping his memory alive. For not letting him be just another statistic." After Chin left, Patricia, the woman whose son was still missing, touched Margaret's arm. "That must feel good," Patricia said. "Knowing something positive came from all that pain." Margaret nodded. "It does. But I'd still rather have him back." "Of course. We all would." They stood together in the parking lot, two women bound by understanding that most people would never share, grateful for each other's presence even as they wished the circumstances that brought them together had never existed. 5 years after Tom Bradley's remains were found, Margaret stood in her garden on a warm May afternoon, her hands deep in soil, planting roses. She'd taken up gardening as therapy, something her counselor had suggested. "Create life," the counselor had said. "After so much death, create something that grows." The garden had started small, a few flower boxes on the porch. But it grew season by season, until her backyard had become a riot of color and life. Tom would have loved it. He'd always talked about having a garden someday when work slowed down, when there was time. There was never time. Not for him. But Margaret had time. She had all the time in the world. The doorbell rang. Margaret pulled off her gardening gloves and went inside, tracking dirt through the kitchen despite her best efforts. A deliverman stood on the porch with a certified letter. Margaret signed for it, curious. Inside was a letter from the Michigan Department of Corrections. Edward Miller had died. Heart attack in his cell. Quick, the letter said, probably didn't suffer much. Margaret sat down at her kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Miller was dead. The man who'd killed her husband, who'd buried him in the ground, who'd let her suffer for 14 years, dead. She waited to feel something. Relief maybe. Satisfaction. Closure. But all she felt was tired. She called Sarah first, then Emily. Both offered to come home, but Margaret told them it wasn't necessary. "It doesn't change anything," she said. "Tom's still gone. Miller's death doesn't bring him back." "But he's finally paid for what he did," Sarah argued. "Has he? He got to live 20 more years than your father did. He got to see sunrises, eat meals, breathe air. Even in prison he was alive. I'm not sure that counts as paying." After the calls, Margaret sat on her porch, the porch where the light had burned for so many years. She'd replaced the motion sensor with a regular switch years ago, turning it on only when she needed it. Tonight, she left it off and sat in the darkness. Miller was dead, but Tom was still dead too. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But justice was cold comfort. The real lesson, Margaret thought, wasn't about justice at all. It was about what you do with the time you have. How you choose to live in the shadow of tragedy. Whether you let bitterness consume you or find some way, any way, to transform pain into purpose. Miller had chosen bitterness. He'd let a 2-year prison sentence destroy his entire life. His hatred had metastasized until it killed not just Tom Bradley but any chance Miller had at redemption, at peace, at being anything other than a murderer. Margaret had chosen differently. Not because she was better or stronger, but because she had people depending on her. 2 daughters who needed their mother not to disappear into grief, families at the center who needed someone who understood. She'd chosen to keep going not because she wanted to, but because stopping wasn't an option. And over time that choice had become easier. The weight had lightened. The path had become clearer. "Life after," she said to the darkness, remembering something she'd thought years ago, "doesn't mean life without. It means life with the truth." The truth was that Tom was gone. That he'd died badly at the hands of someone who hated him for doing his job. That 14 years had been stolen from their family by one man's choice to answer violence with violence. But the truth was also that Tom had lived. That he'd been a good man, a good father, a good husband. That he'd touched lives, helped people, made a difference. That legacy didn't die when he did. It lived on in Sarah's work, in Emily's compassion, in Margaret's advocacy. It lived on in the Bradley Protocol, in the officers who touched his plaque each morning, in the families who sat on the blue bench and found strange comfort. Edward Miller's legacy was a shallow grave and a prison cell. Tom Bradley's legacy was still growing, still spreading, still making the world incrementally better. Margaret stood and went inside. She poured herself a glass of wine and toasted the empty kitchen. "You won, Tom," she whispered. "You won." Detroit continues to change as all cities do. Buildings rise and fall. Streets get renamed. People come and go. But some things remain. In the precinct lobby, officers still touch Thomas Bradley's plaque as they enter and exit. It's become ritual, superstition, prayer, a reminder that they're part of something larger than themselves. At the academy, recruits still learn about the night an officer vanished and what his disappearance taught the department about brotherhood, vigilance, and the importance of never giving up on one of their own. In a small park where trash once accumulated and hope went to die, people still sit on a blue bench marked "Found at Last," finding their own meaning in those simple words. And in a house on the east side, in a garden that bursts with color each spring, Margaret Bradley tends her roses and thinks about her husband. She's 73 now. Her hair is white, her hands spotted with age, her knees complaining more each year. Sarah visits with grandchildren Tom never got to meet. Emily is married to Marcus, that patient, kind man who understands that some griefs never fully heal. Margaret no longer volunteers at the center. She passed that torch to younger women who remind her of herself decades ago, still raw with loss but determined to help others. She's earned her rest. On quiet evenings, she sits on her porch with a book and a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood kids play in the street. Sometimes she thinks about that November night in 1984, about the last time she saw Tom, about the kiss he gave her before heading to work. "Be safe," she'd said. "Always am," he'd replied. She wonders what would have happened if he hadn't switched shifts with Marcus Chin. Someone else had taken that call. If the rain hadn't been so heavy, the night so dark, the circumstances so perfectly aligned for tragedy. But these thoughts don't consume her anymore. They're just shadows passing through her mind, acknowledged and released. Because Margaret Bradley learned something over 34 years of grief, recovery, and eventual peace. Some questions have no answers. Some losses leave permanent scars. Some stories don't end happily. But life continues anyway. And in that continuation, in the children who grow, the gardens that bloom, the memories that persist, there is meaning. Not the meaning you wanted. Not the story you choose to live. But meaning nonetheless. Justice isn't always swift. Sometimes it's slow, stumbling, incomplete. Sometimes it arrives 14 years late on a cold morning when a dog digs in the dirt and exposes what was buried. Sometimes the guilty die unpunished in spirit even as they're punished in body. Sometimes the innocent suffer despite doing everything right. But even imperfect justice matters. Even late answers help. Even painful truths are better than endless questions. Thomas Bradley was found. His family got their answers. The city learned its lessons. That's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. And sometimes something is all we get. The screen fades to black over the Detroit skyline at dusk, lights beginning to glow as day surrenders to night. Somewhere in that vast cityscape someone is missing. Someone else is waiting. Another family is holding vigil, hoping for news, desperate for closure. Their story is just beginning. But because of Thomas Bradley, because of Margaret's determination, because of one dog's stubborn refusal to leave a scent untouched, they won't wait alone. The protocols exist. The resources are there. The memories remain. Stories like Tom's don't end when the case closes. They live on in every call answered, every search continued, every light left burning in the darkness. They live on in the people who refuse to forget, who transform tragedy into purpose, who insist that every missing person matters, every family deserves answers, every name should be remembered. This is how we honor the dead, not by freezing them in time but by letting their stories change us, teach us, push us to be better than we were before they left. Thomas Bradley went to work on a stormy November night and never came home. His absence created a void that could never be filled. But in that void something grew. Awareness, compassion, change. That's his real legacy. Not the plaque or the protocol or the blue bench, though those matter too. His legacy is the understanding that every person who disappears leaves behind a web of people whose lives are forever altered. And those people deserve better than silence, better than cold case files gathering dust, better than 14 years of not knowing. They deserve truth. Even painful truth. Even truth that comes too late. Because in the end, truth is all we have. Truth and memory and the choice we make about what to do with both. Margaret Bradley chose to remember without being destroyed by remembering. To grieve without drowning in grief. To find purpose in pain. That choice didn't erase what happened. Didn't bring Tom back. Didn't make anything okay. But it kept her alive. It kept her daughters alive. It helped other families survive their own nightmares. And in a world where control is often an illusion, where tragedy strikes without warning, where good people die for no reason at all, sometimes survival is the only victory available. So if this story has moved you, if you believe stories like Tom's deserve to be remembered, if you think no missing person should ever be forgotten, share it. Remember it. Let it change how you see the world. Because every view keeps their memory alive. Every share reaches another family who needs to know they're not alone. Every comment builds a community of people who understand that some stories, however painful, must be told. That's how we keep the light burning. Not on one porch in Detroit, but in every heart that refuses to let the missing fade into silence. That's how we honor Thomas Bradley and everyone like him. By remembering. By caring. By never giving up. Even when 14 years pass and hope seems impossible, especially then. Because sometimes the impossible happens. Sometimes dogs dig in vacant lots. Sometimes buried truths surface. Sometimes families get the answers they've been waiting for. And sometimes, just sometimes, late justice is better than no justice at all.